Why am I fake paying you to fake stand around? 3, 4, beep, beep, boop, bop, bop, beep. Beep, 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 boop, boop, booze. Well, once again, you found me in rather a loopy, punchy. I didn't sound like a terrible day or anything. Exhausting though. Since I started working at this funny book store, is this thing on? Tuning fork. Musician likes to say in tune. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but when I was 18 years old, I made a solemn oath. I took a solemn oath to quote Spinal Tap every single day of my life, and I've not failed. It's one of the very few things that I promised myself I would do that I've actually followed through to the letter. Anyway, we recently got a bunch more storage space at the funny book store for back issues. So the back issue section is now larger, which means I had to shift everything. If you're not familiar, this is what it sounds like. You know, the books are all alphabetical, but then they're all kind of crammed in there. So in the middle of the back issues, we had a whole new container. I don't know what else to call it. We have these very specific cabinets that have an open top you can put books in, and then two large drawers that you can also cram books in. You can fit a couple thousand in there, I want to say. So until I can replenish our floor stock to that extent, I just have to kind of move everything. And boy, I had to do it a couple weeks ago just to make some room. And my tennis elbow, which is I haven't played tennis since I was 16 years of age. So, and I think I broke my thumb, which is a Ferris Bueller quote, but I really think I might have done something because it's kind of numb up here and it's just kind of stiff. It's all the grabbing, and it's not like it's intensive physical labor, but it's certainly more than just me sitting on my ass uh, looking on eBay for how much comics cost. But enough about you. So first this week, let's see what I want to do. Well, here's the big one for this week, or one of the big ones. The Amazing Spider-Man number one. This is volume 5? I mean, I would have thought it would be more myself, but I'm not going to look again. I'm pretty sure it's 5 or 6. I mean, The Punisher is up to volume 13, and Iron Man also, I believe. But Amazing Spider-Man has managed to hold on to its legacy numbering for the most part. Also, not really. It is one of those books, though, that I don't know. So, I've had a long, arduous journey with this particular title, The Amazing Spider-Man. Jimmy, what's the difference between that and Spider-Man? There's not really. When Spider-Man got his own book after Amazing Fantasy number 15, the first issue was called The Amazing Spider-Man number 1. And amazing has been the adjective connected to that title ever since. But everyone just called it Spider-Man. In the late 70s, though, they introduced a second Spider-Man title. Well, technically a third if you count Marvel Team Up. But this one was called Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, later shortened to just Spectacular Spider-Man. And then when I was a kid, a few years before I started collecting comics, they introduced a third monthly Spider-Man title called Web of Spider-Man. And then a couple years later, they introduced an adjective list title, which is called Spider-Man. And so this has caused no end of confusion to your your average jerk on the street. So Amazing has always been the main title, though. Amazing is when people say Spider-Man, that's usually the title they're thinking of. And all the major, historical things that tend to happen in Amazing Spider-Man. That's like the main title. Spectacular and Web of and even Spider-Man are just kind of offshoots of Amazing. And even from a young age, I didn't read that much Amazing. When I started collecting comics, Amazing Spider-Man was then being drawn by Todd McFarlane, who was huge immediately, a huge rock star. And I was super into his work, but they were hard to find. And also they had a lot of Venom in them as a character I didn't really give a crap about, but Spectacular Spider-Man was my favorite. I also read Web of, as nerds would call it. But Spectacular has always been my book because one of the first books I bought, like within the first 25 or so of me collecting comics, was Spectacular Spider-Man 147. In fact, I don't know if I've told this story. One of the best days of my life that I can recall was when I was a mere slip of a lad at 11, and it was early January 1989. My father and my sister were out on a camping trip. They were in a thing called Indian Princesses, which I'm sure is no longer a thing, but it was like a father daughter Cub Scout, Girl Scouts type thing. So they were off on a camping trip. So it was just me and my mom. My mom took me to the mall that Saturday. We saw the Bill Murray movie Scrooge, which is still my favorite Bill Murray movie. Not just because of this nice day. It was just a nice day, is my point. My old man was out of the house, so it wasn't all. I didn't have to worry about catching a beating. And I got to go see a Bill Murray movie, and then my mom bought me a copy of Spectacular Spider-Man 147, which was during the Inferno event, which was my first introduction to, superhero events. And 146 had an even better cover. I think maybe it was 148. 147 is the cover is Jonah Jameson and Spider-Man fighting demons back to back. And either 146 or 148 was an incredible cover of Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy, and I think at least one other supporting member, all coming out of their graves. Oh, man. Anyway, so Spectacular was my shit. To the point where, and Sal Buscema drew Spectacular, so he's my favorite Buscema. John Buscema is the more well-known one, and most people tend to think he's superior. I prefer Sal, our pal Sal, as they used to call him. So Amazing just never really didn't excite me in the same way that Spectacular did. Plus, Spectacular around that time had a lot of Tombstone, who was a great villain. Yeah. All three titles sort of wove in and out of each other, but you didn't need to read all three of them. Or you didn't, I would read Spectacular, I didn't need to read. They would have little editorial notes. See Amazing Spider-Man to see what he's talking about here, but I rarely did. So that always was kind of the case. I never really bought Amazing Spider-Man regularly. I have tons of Amazing Spider-Man. I have the omnibus with the first 30 issues or so that Ditko drew. And I have tons of the title, but Spectacular was always more my thing. And then I kind of bailed on comics for a while, and when I came back full force, I love Spider-Man. He's obviously a great character. He's Marvel's flagship character, so I kind of have to like him. But honestly, that was the other thing. When I was in high school, Amazing Spider-Man was what the Clone Saga was, which was a big, overdone storyline, which ended up with a clone of Peter Parker running around, who's now the Scarlet Spider. His parents came back for a minute. I didn't care about any of that stuff. When I started buying comics again in earnest in the early 2000s, there was only Amazing Spider-Man, and I didn't buy it. I did start buying Ultimate Spider-Man, though, and I eventually got the back issues that I'd missed. Well, not the original first, trades. So I had that whole run. I preferred that. It was, especially for having walked away from superhero comics for a while, it was a fun Spider-Man book to get back into without a lot of continuity to have to know. In fact, most of it I knew because they would introduce the whole Ultimate Universe, which that's another episode. So I read Ultimate Spider-Man, which was good, but at the time was not at all connected to mainstream continuity 616 Spider-Man. And isn't really now. Well, Miles Morales ended up being, again, I don't want to get into this whole thing. And then it all went downhill, man. So I want to say, 05, yeah, which would have been when I started working at the comic book store back home. They started there was Amazing Spider-Man, and then there was an adjectiveless Spider-Man still going on, which had started out as Marvel Knights Spider-Man. And I didn't read either of those. I read Ultimate Spider-Man. And then in 2005, I believe it was, they introduced a title called Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. And that was written by Peter David, who I've always really liked. He was big on the Hulk. He wrote the Hulk for a very long time, and he also wrote X Factor for a long time. And I'd always just enjoyed his work. He's a very prolific writer. He's written tons of stuff, but those were his big titles at the time, especially. And so he was getting a crack at a Spider-Man book. I said, hell yeah, I'll read this. And even then, and also because it felt like I didn't have to be reading the other two titles to be able to follow it, and that was mostly true. Eventually, they did do a crossover in the Spider-Man titles called The Other, which I did buy all of those issues. And that was a great story. It was not long after the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies had already come out. And it was a story wherein Spider-Man fought this villain called Morlun, who ends up being the main villain in Spider-Verse. I could be misremembering this, so please forgive me. But at one point in The Other, Spider-Man actually dies. And then he ends up cocooning himself underneath the Brooklyn Bridge, I think it was, or maybe it was the Brooklyn Bridge. Manhattan, whatever. What is that? What is the Dumbo Bridge down under Manhattan? Whatever. And then when he came out, he was more powered. Essentially what they were trying to do, they made it so that now his webs came out of his wrists, which had never been the case. But the film introduced, those films were like, well, it makes more sense, actually. And it does. I mean, if you're going to talk about superpowers and stuff, he's got all these spider powers, but he has to make his own web fluid. And at the time, he's like a 16-year-old, but he makes this incredible adhesive that would revolutionize, everything. But he's using it to look in ladies' windows. No, he's not. That's what I would do. So they made that. They also kind of, and I think this was Peter David's direct influence, made it. The notion of spider sense was always a weird power for Peter Parker to have. Spider-Man has a sense that tells him when he's in immediate danger. And that didn't ever make much sense. You don't know. I don't know. Maybe spiders have that. They're not very talkative. But the way Peter David kind of laid it out was that Spider-Man is in tune more with the web of life. And so when there's disturbances in that web, he can feel it. And I'm like, okay, that's kind of silly, but it's more it's more of an explanation. And so my point is, I was really getting into the direction they were going with the character. I was excited about Spider-Man for the first time in a long time. And then Joe Quesada came in and shit all over it. So back in the early aughts, late 90s, Joe Quesada, who up to that point had mostly been a penciler, but I think he'd also written and was doing some editing. He became editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, and he decreed 3 things that were to happen. One, no characters were allowed to smoke anymore because his father had died of lung cancer. So that means the Thing doesn't smoke cigars anymore. Nick Fury and Wolverine don't smoke anymore. And I was a lot angrier about it 20 years ago. I've come to just kind of accept that we are literally a dying breed, and that's fine. The sooner the better, frankly. Second thing, what I actually could get behind was he said there are far too many mutants in the Marvel Universe. We need to thin this herd a little bit. Because the whole premise of the X-Men was that mutant kind was more powered, but they were the minority. Because it was initially a allegory for race relations in America. Instead of the allegory for gay relations in America that it is now. Gay, straight relations. But when mutants really blew up in the 80s, they just started creating so many. And they would try to, they had the Fall of Mutants storyline, the Mutant Massacre storyline. There would be storylines where they would try, I think, to kind of rein it in a little bit. But mutants were just so popular in the 90s, especially, that they just kept creating more and more. So by the time the early aughts rolled around, he was like, and I was actually fine with that. And they did do that in the Decimation storyline, or it was right after House of M. So House of M was a storyline from 2004, which I'm actually currently rereading and holds up excellently. It's really, really good. Where, and this will be familiar to the viewers of WandaVision, but in the storyline, the Scarlet Witch utilizes all of her powers to to alter reality where mutants were the superior race, and that Magneto was like ruler of the Earth, basically, and humans were the minority and oppressed thusly. And then after that ends, Wanda. So at the beginning of that story, Wanda says, "No more humans," right? Something like that. And so it becomes more all mutants are the majority. At the end of House of M, she says, "No more mutants," and so most mutants became depowered, and 198 were left. That was, I don't know that they ever listed exactly which 198 mutants like retain their powers. I don't even know how they ever really explained that. If she says no more mutants, how she managed to leave almost 200 out on the men on base. But that was a fun storyline. So Decimation was after that, even though technically Decimation means to reduce by 10%. But it did reset the storyline. So it's like, oh, okay, shit, now we have to protect a world that hates and fears us instead of a world that we almost basically run. And so, like, the popular, Wolverine kept his powers, like the big ones, coincidentally, but a lot of people got depowered. Richter, who was in X Factor, was depowered. I remember that specifically. There were a few others, but I can't remember. Well, there were tons of others, but they didn't all come up in the storyline. But it was great. And now, that was 15 years ago plus, so it's kind of trickled back up. And now that Krakoa is its own nation, it kind of makes sense to have that many. They all live there. Third thing that Joe Quesada decided he was going to change was he didn't want Spider-Man to be the way it was. And I was like, okay, well, fuck me then, I guess. And he was like, he thought that Spider-Man went downhill when he married Mary Jane Watson, which I couldn't disagree with more. I've always liked them as a couple. And I think at this point now they are back together. But I'll get to that. And feel free to not watch this. You want to hear all this shit. So he decided to revert everything back to before they got married. Ugh. And it was just okay. So that storyline was called One More Day. During the Civil War, Peter Parker revealed to the world that he was, in fact, the Amazing Spider-Man and had been since he was 15 years old. His identity was public now, and it was a big deal. And even after the Civil War was over, it was like, oh, now what do we do? So naturally, Aunt May gets almost killed. There's an attempt on her life. I don't remember by who. I would imagine it was Kingpin, but I can't remember now. And since Peter Parker has an unhealthy mother figure relationship going on with his Aunt May, he tries everything. He tries to Reed Richards and Tony Stark to scientifically figure it out. He goes to Doctor Strange. There's a magic way we can get her out of this coma. Like, she's in this coma about to die. And there is even a point where Mary Jane's like, she is an old lady. I mean, maybe. But of course, he won't hear of it. This One More Day was written by J. Michael Straczynski, who is a writer that I've always liked. And I thought I knew where it was going, but I was like, well, at least Straczynski's script is good. But even he got to the end of this, and with the end, I don't know what exactly it was that he didn't like about it, but he said, fuck this. He wanted to take his name off of it, but I don't think they let him. But he washed his hands of the thing before it was officially over. So what happens is Spider-Man goes to Mephisto, who is the Satan of the Marvel Universe, basically, and offers to sell his soul. And Mephisto's like, I don't know what Twilight Zone's even watching. We're not really doing that much anymore. He says, though, that he will bring Aunt May to life. He will save her from certain death. But he's going to make it so that Peter Parker and Mary Jane never got married. And that was the price he exacted. And that he's like, you will not, he goes, everything will go back to normal. Because that was Mary Jane's thing. He's like, well, you're going to bring her back to life, but then his identity is still out there. She's going to get killed again. And he says, I can make it so that no one remembers that he's Spider-Man, including his aunt. And so she'll be safe from, he'll still be Spider-Man and he'll still run that risk, but no one will know he's Peter Parker. And Mephisto says that both of your souls will be, at least a part of your souls will be screaming because you're not together anymore. And that's the deliciously, devilishly price that he's exacting. Which, now I'm saying out loud, is actually really cool. But then that was it. And then Brand New Day was the next arc. And I read the first issue and I went, because it was exactly what Joe Quesada said. It was Spider-Man stories from 1986. I can read Spider-Man stories from 1986 whenever I feel like it. I have the Marvel Unlimited app. And even before that, I have tons of comics from that time. I don't need to go backwards, which you'll rarely hear from superhero comic book readers. But I was like, the character was so much more interesting, and now you've made all of that. And that was what Quesada would say. Remember how much fun it was when Spider-Man would run out of web fluid and then he would have to fight Dr. Octopus? Go fuck yourself. What I heard when he said that was, remember when we used to be able to write him into corners that we can't write him into anymore? And I was like, yeah, I do remember that. It got boring after a while, so they made, Peter David and company made some new stuff that you didn't even give a chance. It only went for a couple years. So that was actually, if I remember right, was the last time I got really mad about a thing like this. And I went, never read Spider-Man again. And it was 15 years ago, and here we are. So after that, Dan Slott took over Amazing Spider-Man, which I was really bummed about because I really like Dan Slott's writing. I can still go back and read him now. They did do a cool thing where Dr. Octopus became Spider-Man for a while. And then Nick Spencer was writing Spider-Man for the last few years. I want to say like 5 years before this. And that's a really good run. And I'm going to go back and read that. I mean, I've heard nothing but good things. I do believe at this point that him and Mary Jane are back together. He still only has web shooters, but this is also written by Zeb Wells, who has been around for a long time, but since he recently finished his run on Hellions, I really, really like that. So I was like, yeah, I'll buy this. And John Romita Jr. is drawn, and he's always going to be a draw for me. So that was the first pick of the week. Boy, all right, I'll try to get through the rest of these because I got dinner to make. Also this week, which actually is supposed to come out last week, Kaiju Max Season 6, Number 6. This is the final issue of Kaiju Max for good. So 6 volumes at 6 issues apiece. That's what, 300 issues? I don't do math very well. 6 times 6 is what? 36? Yeah, that sounds right. So 36 issues of Kaiju Max later, and man, I'm really going to miss this book. I think I can probably check out the trades in the library. Volume 5 I have in trade. The rest of them I have in single issues, but I think they're all back in San Diego. I would really love to go back and read this. I don't even really like kaiju movies that much. Xander Cannon loves them. And I feel like I've talked about this book before anyway. So I just wanted to get to this first. This also came out last week. Flashpoint Beyond number 0, which is, first of all, drawn by Eduardo Risso, which is good enough for me. Written by Jeff Johns, who wrote Flashpoint back, gosh, I guess this would have been around that same time. No, I guess it would have been closer to 08, 09, maybe. 2010. Flashpoint was a really fun series, event, which I just reread this weekend, in fact. I read the core book. There's a bunch of spin-offs that I want to get back into also. But Flashpoint is one of the, and this is certainly not a new premise, but it's always fun to me. Is the Barry Allen, the flat or Wally? Was it Wally or Barry? I think it's Barry. Yeah, Barry Allen wakes up one day and he's no longer the Flash, and Superman is nowhere to be found. The world has completely changed. His mother is still alive. Um, Everything's topsy turvy, but he's like, this isn't right. Like he can still remember the world as it was, and he goes, "Oh, the Reverse Flash must have gone back in time and fucked everything up." So he hunts down Batman, who's still active, but turns out that it's Thomas Wayne, Bruce Wayne's father. And in that infamous evening in Crime Alley, it was Bruce who dies, and not well, Bruce and his wife, Martha, Thomas's wife, die, and so Thomas Wayne becomes Batman. How Barry Allen's mother being alive creates that particular ripple effect is beyond me. Also, where it's like Superman landed in Metropolis instead of Smallville, and so the government got him right away and all this stuff. So it's this alternate universe, and he has to put everything back. So now they're revisiting that well, but this now it's going to be Thomas Wayne who is the focal character, and so I'm looking forward to that. Eduardo Riso is a great artist. I thought I mentioned that too. And then I may not get to this week, but I am going to get to it soon, and I'm going to talk about it after I read it. It's called Rock and Roll Terrorist: The Graphic Life of Shock Rocker Gigi Allen by Reed Chancellor. I'll talk about it more when I read it, but Warren saw this he's ordering from this Microcosm pub, or possibly from just a small distributor, which is one of my favorite things about this shop that I work at, Galaxy of Comics in Van Nuys, California. He really goes out of his way to try to get indie stuff. And he saw this and he goes, I don't know who Gigi Allen is, but I guarantee you Jimmy does. And he was very right. And he just gave this to me. But I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I would have paid for it. It was only $15, but yeah. Reed Chancellor's name I recognize, but when I looked him up, I don't think I've read anything by him. I mean, his art looks like my sort of thing too. But yeah. Rock and Roll Terrorist is a very, very, very apt way to describe Gigi Allen. And I'll tell my Gigi story after I read it. It's actually my friend Sammy's Gigi story. But since Gigi died before I got a chance to see him, I just have to use Sammy's Gigi story that he told me. And if I do say so, I think I tell it pretty well. Okay, Christ almighty. All right. You know what? I try not to pay too much attention to the analytics that YouTube gives me on this thing. But I can't imagine anybody's watching this anymore. So I guess it doesn't matter if I go over a half an hour. I did have to explain the history of the character of Spider-Man to the minutest detail. All right. I did get a lot of reading in last week. And here's what I got. So I read this Doctor Strange Nexus of Nightmares, another Ralph Macchio one-shot. It was fun. It was good. I enjoyed it. But I remembered how this works. Macchio will write these, I think I would say probably every 8 to 14 months he writes a one-shot for Marvel. And I hope he continues to do it. Sincerely. But every time he does, I pick it up. I'll pick one up. Every time I pick one up, I go, oh, wow, Macchio's writing again. And then I'll pick it up and I'll go, I didn't need this. I didn't need this. I could have just read it on the app, which is a shitty thing for a comic book store employee to say, but they're fun little one-shots. The Thunderbolts one he did is the only one I really want to keep because I have a full run of Thunderbolts, and I like that team a lot. And I love Doctor Strange too, and I have a big chunk of Doctor Strange, like of the whole title, the 2 or 3 series he's had over the years. Yeah, it was good. Yeah. It does take place currently, but before Doctor Strange died recently, so it was fine. This was also in a similar vein. Well, maybe not. I'm going to read the rest of this series. This is the Joneses, 1 of 5. This is a spin-off of the Resistance title, which is AWA's kind of flagship title, I would say. In that title, there's a plague, well, on the nose, a plague that kills a bunch of people and also gives a bunch of people superpowers. And so now these superpowered people have to figure out how to fit in, and there's a general panic about them and stuff. And so there's been two, if not now three, Resistance series. They've also had a few spin-offs, like that Knighted book that I've been reading, which I've been enjoying. It's a spin-off. It takes place in that universe. AWA publishes stuff that doesn't take place in the Resistance universe, tons of it. But they also are like clearly like, we're trying to build a little bit of a continuity here. And the Joneses also are in this. So the Joneses are a nice American family who are all now superpowered and are trying their best to keep their friends and neighbors from finding out, but also finding that they want to use these powers for good, so they shouldn't be hiding them. So it's good. It's definitely kind of an allegory for trying to live in a scary America, divided America. It's pretty apt, and it's fun. And it's Moresi who wrote Barbaric, which I mentioned, and Alessandro Vitti. It didn't, but there was that was okay. This is the thing too, and I want to make clear that Michael Moresi very much. I'm a fan of his work, and he has my respect as an artist. But these goddamn back matter things, they make them right nowadays. AWA is the worst of them too. And so Moresi begins. I don't write superhero comics. Okay, fine. I immediately am just like, then because I know it's going to be critical of superheroes. There's nothing wrong with being critical of superheroes, but you don't. So this is like his first superhero comic that he's written, and he's talking about it. And I understand the hook to get you to read this thing. But he talks about wanting to be more like Astro City and stuff like that, which tend to focus more on the emotional side of things, which I think is really doing a disservice to a lot of the work that Marvel and DC has been doing for the last 20 years easy. There's still superhero comics, there's still a lot of big dumb slugfests, but Marvel especially has always been about that kind of emotional connection. And just because it's not indie anymore, and hasn't been for a long time, doesn't mean that they're incapable of doing such a thing. I think that's what bothers me. I'm a big fan of superhero comics, but I don't expect anybody else to, unless you're a child, maybe, or a guy my age. If you don't like them, don't bother with them. I mean, that's the thing. But people are like, superhero. But what if we had a superhero group with an emotional connection? That's the Fantastic Four. This is the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four have real emotions going on, and always have done since Stan and Jack, mostly Jack, first put the ideas to page. And so I bristle at that sort of thing for sure. And honestly, I just bristle at these back matter pages that you can't see I'm pointing. This guy, right? It's always, and it's only in indie books. Definitely in every AWA book, but most Image books, a lot of Dark Horse books, especially the first issue, I have the writer or the artist or both going, oh, so here, and all they're doing is just taking up space. They're just filling pages, which bothers me. Could put 2 more pages of story. I had to have a guy come out and tell me why he's writing a comic book. Honey, I know why you're writing a comic book, because they're fun. You don't need to explain to me, well, so my really, okay. Then, you like comics, I like comics, you write them, I'll read them. We don't need to go beyond that. Son of a bitch. Ever insult Jack Kirby. That's the thing, is it'll get, if there's even a hint of criticism of Jack Kirby or his work, I'll be like, oh, murder you. This was incredible. Apache Delivery Service 1 through 4. I read these. I tore through them. They were so good. I mean, for one thing, Kit and Jenkins have worked together and they know how to do it. This art was way better because he drew Fear Case, which I did the art I don't know. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't very. There's definitely artists who have this problem. Daniel Zelj is one where it's just hard to tell the characters apart. They kind of will like, and I remember in Fear Case, Jenkins drawing the characters. I'm like, which guy is he talking? Who are these two? And I can't even tell them apart in the story. Did not have that problem with this story at all. and there's not a whole lot of. It's very sparse. It ends up being more of a crime story than a Vietnam story, but still very much a Vietnam story. So our main character is this lerp named Ernie, and a lerp, as I read from the many, many, many books about the Vietnam War that I've read over the years, long range reconnaissance patrol. And these were guys who would go out by themselves into the jungle and well, in this particular instance, he would go out by himself as he's a sniper, and he would find bases or targets and then he would radio in the coordinates, and they would send bombs, and they would write Apache Delivery Service, and that became Ernie's because he was Native American, not Apache, which he tries to point out, and they still keep calling him Apache Delivery Service. And then he meets this other guy who is a non-combatant, but he's not Vietnamese or American, I don't think. But he is searching for this hidden buried treasure, basically. And he enlists Ernie to help him out. And then so we get then this kind of treasure Sierra Madre thing going. Also very much an allegory for the actual Vietnam War. And it was just, I loved it. Loved it, loved it, loved it. Can't say it enough. One of my favorite books of 2022 so far. Very sure. As long as we're on a Nam kick, I also read Vietnam Journal Hamburger Hill by Don Lomax. I don't think I mentioned this before, and I'm going to try it because I got a goddamn Cerebus book to get to. That won't take very long. Actually, I'm going to save this for next week because I'm already getting close to 40 minutes. Don Lomax is a 40-year guy now doing comics, mostly about Nam. He was over there, I want to say, in 1967, and he took copious notes. And, I mean, war comics are a very big deal to certain dudes. I'm not nearly as hardcore as, like, my former boss at the comic shop I worked at in San Diego was. But war comics guys are very, and I mean, I think Lomax has really made a very nice living, or at least a comfortable one over the years, on only doing war books. He's done other stuff. In fact, I think I mentioned an old Bruce Jones book. It was a horror, like a Tales from the Crypt type thing. Lomax did one of those. But most of what he's written and drawn have all been Vietnam books. He wrote the Nam for Marvel Comics. I don't think he drew much of it. And he did these one-page strips about Hamburger Hill for Gallery magazine or some magazine. And then they were collected into this here. Gallery, yeah. So he did a book called Vietnam Journal for years and years and years. I have a couple issues here and there. All very small publishers. I mean, this is published by Caliber, who I think published a lot of Vietnam Journal. Vietnam Journal is the focus is this guy Journal, who's an actual journalist. And so through his eyes, we see all these things. And he's at Hamburger Hill, which was Hill 398, I want to say. And it was a real meat grinder, hence the name. And that's actually, when I went through my big Vietnam War movie phase my senior year of high school. Hamburger Hill was the only one I never got to see for whatever reason. But yeah, it's a major battle in Vietnam. I want to say it was in spring of '69. Yeah, May 13th to May 20th, 1969. It was a hill that MacV was like, go out and capture it from Charlie, and the grunts were like, all right, and then just got murderized. But then, there were significant casualties on the other side too. But I just read it, I don't remember. I think eventually they bombed. I should probably just look, because it is a historical thing. So this is like fictionalized, but it's all based on very real stuff. My only problem, this has been my problem with Don Lomax's work, and a lot of these indie guys' work, is, boy, these guys need a proofreader. Just to catch little things. How does Hamburger Hill end? Well, you know what? I'll give you my dad's number. I'm sure he knows. I don't think he was there because my dad was on Da Nang more. He was on a riverboat, so he wasn't in the bush as much. And so, yeah, Hamburger Hill was mostly. He was also in the army, which I think Hamburger Hill was mostly a Marines thing. But yeah, good stuff, fun stuff for single dads. That was one of the few jokes that I had for the Zoom comedy year of 2020 was, and it was a riff at first, but I would use it a lot. And this next to my computer on my desk, I had a stack of books about Vietnam, and so I said, "Hey, if there's any doubt that I am in fact a single father, here is Exhibit A, a stack of books about the Vietnam War. I like to read about Nam. What can I tell you? Anyway, we'll tune in next week for this rather disappointing outing in Sarah. We finally, yeah, that'll be the cliffhanger. Oh, Jim finally gets sick of Cerebus. It happens. All right. 41 minutes. That was of gold. You're welcome.